What if Italy left the euro? How many times have we heard this question in the news or from political parties? Can we look to the past to see what might happen in the future? In this case, yes, because Italy has already left the euro in the past. Actually, it wasn't called the euro back then, it was called the ECU, the European Currency Unit. But it was the forerunner of the euro, and we can see what happened on that occasion. If the future tends to repeat the past, we have a possible scenario of what could happen if Italy left the euro. So, from a historical perspective, all we can do is look at what happened during the years when the European Union was created to understand what actually took place, in particular to Italy. And a key variable for doing this is looking at the exchange rate between the lira and the then ancestor of the euro, the ECU, European Currency Unit. This exchange rate shows a fairly stable trend up until the creation of the European Union with the Maastricht Treaty in 1992. From 92 to 96, however, Italy's economic situation was particularly turbulent. And we can see that the exchange rate keeps getting worse. In the graph, the exchange rate goes up, which means it takes more and more lire to buy the same amount of euros. So Italy is seen as increasingly weak. In 1992, in particular, when the so-called First Republic fell and the Amato and Ciampi technical governments came in, Italy was in such a crisis that it even had to leave the ECU agreements. And here we are, in fact, at the exit from the euro. At that moment, the exchange rate skyrockets. We go from an exchange rate that was reasonable, given Italy's economic data, to an exchange rate that was excessive for Italy's economic situation. We can see this clearly in the graph. At this point, Italy is forced to abandon the European Union agreements, but it will have to rejoin them sooner or later. How much time does Italy have? The Maastricht Treaty states that a country must remain within the ERM agreements for at least 2 years before the euro is established on January 1, 1999. 2 years means you have to stay within the system during 1998 and 1997. So we have time until 1996. The Italian government is relatively calm. It's 1992, there's still plenty of time. Or maybe not. In fact, when Italy decides to rejoin the European agreements for the single currency, the euro, it's already too late. It's the year 1996. It took too many years for Italy to recover from the losses in 1992. The then Italian Prime Minister, Romano Prodi, even decided to fly to Spain to look for a friendly ally in the government of his counterpart, Aznar. In their meeting, it turns out that Aznar wanted to join the euro on January 1, 1999, along with all the other countries. So there's no time left for Italy. Italy has to re-enter the euro immediately, and it's the end of '96. The Italian Prime Minister, Romano Prodi, immediately tasks his Treasury Minister, Carlo Azeglio Ciampi, who was already the governor of the Bank of Italy, to go to Brussels to find an agreement to immediately rejoin the European Union and the euro. They do manage to reach an agreement. The agreement is an exchange rate of 1,936.27 lire for €1. It's a number that's now etched in the memory of many Italians. This isn't a number made up by Brussels bureaucrats. It's a number that was in effect on the financial markets at the moment when Ciampi managed to renegotiate Italy's entry into the euro. Is this exchange rate a good one? Not particularly for Italy. We can see it in the graph. It's still a very high exchange rate. Italy is still considered very risky. So we've lost value over these years, during the years of our crises. It wasn't the fault of any other European country. The crisis of 1992, that went on until 1996, were entirely Italy's and the internal Italian system's fault. What does such an unfavorable exchange rate mean for Italy? Italy mainly imports one crucial resource for its industry, energy. It isn't able to produce enough energy for all the industrial activity it carries out, so Italy always has to pay more and more to import this energy. Economists predict that there will be strong inflation. If Italy is devalued, it will leave the ECU and will have to deal with a sharp increase in energy prices. Obviously, companies will be able to sell their products at higher prices to avoid losses. So there will be strong inflation. But there wasn't any inflation. Why this inflation, which economists predicted, not actually happening? Often, economists' predictions don't come true. There's even a running joke about it. They say an economist is someone who can tell you tomorrow why his predictions from yesterday didn't come true today. And that's exactly what economics does at its core. It studies data to try to explain the past. To be able to explain what's happening today, we'll need data from the future. However, in the case of Italy leaving the ECU, we already have all the available data from 1992 to 1996, which we can see in this chart, showing the trends in inflation and wage levels. These are two particularly important indicators for workers, especially for employees. When salaries increase, but the growth rate is lower than that of inflation, employees are losing purchasing power. Fortunately, we can see in the chart that wage increases are always a bit higher than the rise in inflation. So, historically, workers have managed to gain purchasing power. Except in one specific case, which is the years from 1992 to 1996. We can see them in the chart. Those are 4 consecutive years inflation was higher than salaries. So inflation was rising, but the prices were increasing at a faster rate than the rising salaries. Therefore, employees were losing purchasing power. So let's see why inflation didn't go up. In 1992, the Amato government abolished the pay scale. It was a mechanism that, by law, allowed for the automatic adjustment of salaries to inflation. Once this is no longer required by law, companies could pay salaries that weren't tied to the inflation rate. And they would do so, as we can see from the graph. They'd pay salaries that are lower than inflation. That's how they make up for the high costs caused by importing energy at higher prices. So in any case, there's an impoverishment of the population. Not because of inflation, but because of lower salaries. Leaving the euro was especially costly, particularly for employees. And just how costly was this exit from the euro, quantitatively speaking? We can see it in the lab by downloading all the historical data series we just mentioned. And here we are in the lab. Let's start searching on the Federal Reserve's website, FRED, for Italy's data on salaries and inflation. If we search for Wage Italy, we get 2 historical series, which are actually identical. The most up-to-date one is the one that goes up to July 2025. So we'll choose this one, and the indicator we're interested in is this at the top right. The series we see is the wage level series, but what we want is a rate of change. We can modify this series by clicking on Edit Graph at the top right, and instead of having the wage index as the unit, we can choose to look at the percentage change compared to the previous year. So, for example, wages in January 2025 compared to those in January 2024. If we make this choice, we see the percentage change with very high wage increases, which then decrease in the last few years. We can choose the time frequency of the data. By default, we have monthly frequency, but we might need the annual one to remove too many fluctuations within the months. This way, we see that the historical series is the one we saw during the theoretical part of the lesson. These changes, these adjustments can also be made in R. And in a moment, we'll see how. The second time series that interests us, again from Fred, is the one regarding the consumer price for Italy, so Consumer Price Index Italy. We have inflation consumer price for Italy, updated to October 2024, with annual data, so here too we have annual data. We can go in, see which series interests us, this one, and use it for the software R. At this point, we have all the data we need. And we can go to R, where I can load Lesson 5. This time we're not using the package QuantMod, because QuantMod doesn't allow us to make the changes to the time series that we saw. On the Fred website, you need another package, the FredR package, which means downloading our data from Fred. This requires registering on the Fred website, which I have already done, and I got this code to access the site. Registration is completely free, so you can do it too, or otherwise just copy the code you see here. Now we can download the historical series of salaries, specifying as the unit the percentage change compared to the previous year, PC 1% change 1 year, so the 1 year percentage change, with annual frequency, and as the method for aggregating the data, the average, meaning the average value of the wage growth rate in a year. So we can collect this variable inside X. Here it is. There are 69 observations of 5 variables, including the dates, the series ID, and the values, and so on. We want to take, as a time series, something we can extract using the QuantMod package, which we had loaded before. We can use the zoo series to take the values from X, the dates from X, and create the historical series for salaries, wage. Let's create it. We do the same thing with the consumer price index, inflation, which, however, is already prepared, and we don't need to modify it any further. So inflation will also be a zoo series with values and dates. At this point, we can plot the merged series of salaries and inflation using the usual plot command that we've already seen before. We can add a grid if we want to, and a legend on the top right corner to indicate which are the rates of change for salaries and which are the rates of change for prices. The lines we need to add at this point should indicate the date of exit from the euro, from the EQ, and the date of re-entry into the euro, just like we did in previous lessons. We give the command to create the lines, and the labels will be exit from the euro and re-entry into the euro. This way, we've included all the variables we're interested in. It's not necessary to create a variable called date. We can enter the dates directly within the avaline command. The same goes for the text command. We can enter the dates directly as X, as the X coordinates for the text. And for the labels, we can insert the alphanumeric strings we're interested in. We're now at the end of this lesson. See you next time for new and wonderful adventures.